welcome all of you for coming. Thanks for coming through the rain. It's not very nice today. And thanks for being here at Balliol College, Oxford today. Okay, now although you're aware from the poster that he was a member of your alumni, the question you're no doubt keen for me to answer is simply, who was Joseph Macleod? The answer is that he was primarily a poet, and questions of identity fascinated Macleod and continued to preoccupy him in old age, as Riddle Me Ree, the coda to his final published collection from 1973, An Old Olive Tree, demonstrates. This is item 1 on your handouts. I was afraid and they gave me guts. I was alone and they made me love. Round that wild heat they built a furnace and in the torment smelted me. Out of my fragments came design. I was assembled, I moved, I worked, I grew receptive. Thanks to them, I have fashioned me. Who am I? The simple, commanding diction and syntax of this poem generate a striking clarity on the influences that shaped his identity. For Macleod, it is them, the formative familial ties of a Scottish mother and father, his ancestry, his friends, and his literary friendships, who had been important in the formation of his identity and altered his poetic strategies throughout his career. Macleod made an important contribution to the resurgence of the long poem, and his richly varied verse should attract a much wider audience than it has thus far, but there are various different reasons for this. As I demonstrate in my new book, his published work is astonishingly innovative and displays immense skill and understanding. But the 17-year road to the creation of this book, Hidden Sun, The Poetry of Joseph Macleod, the first of its kind to regard Joseph Macleod's published poetry in its entirety, has not been an easy one. In 2005, having failed to convince my end of first year examiner that the 40,000 words I had accumulated towards a PhD thesis on the comparison of British and American poetry of the interwar years was ever going to reach a conclusion, I was forced to stop, but sent sections off to literary journals who published them. However, having done this, I was left with the problem of finding a new thesis topic on which to restart and indeed resuscitate my PhD. My tutor was very helpful, but discussions with himself and others led nowhere. One afternoon, I dejectedly consigned myself to the University of Glasgow postgraduate bar and pints of Guinness, as you do in that situation. Several hours of deliberating whether I should jack the whole thing in and pack my flat into a removal van, I was approached by Professor Nigel Leask, Regius Chair of English and Scottish Literature. I have to say, I barely knew the guy. He asked if he could join me for a pint. I then said, yes, no problem. He asked what my plans were. I said I had none. Then he asked if I had heard of his cousin, Joseph Macleod, a neglected Scottish modernist poet, one of whom many of his contemporaries felt was a genius. No one had ever researched a PhD about him, and very few had ever written critical assessments on his poetry. Perhaps I might like to look at some of his work in the university library and contact him if I was interested in the project. I agreed. The next day, I went to the library and read over the opening pages of The Women of the Happy Island, Macleod's 1944 volume, and was instantly hooked. The poetry was powerful, liberal, the wordplay adventurous, and the technical control out of this world. I went straight over tonight to see Nigel Leask, who recommended that the next thing I do, before I agreed fully, was to go through Macleod's uncollected correspondence archive, currently held in the university's special collections, to get an idea of the vastness of the project before me. So basically he was trying to put me off. There I saw never before seen letters from William Carlos Williams, Graham Greene, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, W.S. Graham, Compton Mackenzie, and many more. I was filled with enthusiasm, but still Nigel Leask warned me to bear in mind that there were over 10,000 more uncatalogued items of correspondence in the National Library of Scotland archive dedicated to him in Edinburgh. And they're still there, by the way. Already engrossed, I set to work transcribing and cataloguing the hundreds of other uncollected items which had been accidentally found in a dark cupboard. Now you can just go online and find whichever letter you want straight away. I didn't have that advantage. It took me 10 months working 6 to 7 full days a week in Glasgow and at the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh to fully transcribe and catalogue Macleod's correspondence. But I was now in a good position to understand the poet and his world. I began reading over his diaries and analysing his poetry. Born in 1903, Macleod was from a privileged background. His father, Secretary of Rio Tinto. Macleod studied at Rugby School, where his best friend throughout was the future influential art critic Adrian Stokes. He went up to Balliol, Oxford, where, remarkably, we are now, in 1922, almost exactly 100 years ago, and studied law, where his best friend was Graham Greene. They would dine upstairs just here. Also at the same time, there was also, sorry, slightly off the beaten track, Evelyn Waugh was in the same year, as you probably know. He began submitting poems and short stories to the university literary journal, the Oxford Outlook. Does that still exist? No, okay. This was edited at the time by Graham Greene. This is his first journalist job. And Greene published a short story and a poem of Macleod's in every issue where he was editor. And so began a lifetime's mutual admiration of each other's work. On graduating, Macleod was persuaded by his father to continue his law studies at the bar. But Macleod hated law, and though he completed the qualification, never practiced as a barrister. He rebelled against his father, joined the Cambridge Festival Theatre at Barnwell as an actor under the eccentric, although highly stylised direction of Terence Gray. Just before he joined, at the age of 26, Macleod sent his first long poem of 70 pages in length to Ezra Pound. In 1929, Ezra Pound insisted to T.S. Eliot, and I have the letters for this, poetry editor of Faber and Faber at the time, that this book, The Ecliptic, must be published. It appeared in the Faber batch of 3 for 1930, a few months later, alongside W.H. Auden's first collection, Poems, and Macleod's got the better review from the Times Literary Supplement, from the two. It is divided into the 12 phases of the zodiac in 4 to 6 page cantos, and as Macleod explains in the preface, follows the path of a single consciousness through the celestial sphere. Don't worry, I was confused by that as well. Rather than being about astrology, it follows the development of a modernist self across a lifetime. The animals of the zodiac are used as a focal point for movement and for symbols to structure the long poem. The poetry is startling in its wordplay and rhythm, and each zodiac phase is very different in style, imitating the zodiac creatures they concern. The following section is from Cancer, or the Crab. This is, by the way, a very long quotation, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the huge complexity of Macleod's early work. This is item 2 on your handouts. Moon poison, mullock of sacrifice, suffuses the veins of the eyes till the retina, moon-coloured, sees the sideways motion of the cretin crab, hued thus like a tortoise, askew in the glaucous moonscape. A flat hot boulder it, lividly in the midst of the doldrums, sidles. The lunatic, unable to bear the silent course of constellations, mad and stark naked, sidles. The obol of an eyeball of a man dead from elephantiasis, sidles. All three across heaven with a rocking motion. The doldrums, regions of calms, light baffling winds near equator. But the calms are rare, the winds baffling but not light, and the drunken boats belonging to the Crab Club, rock hot and naked to the dawning of the moon, all in the pallescent sargasso weed and windbound, seeking distraction by the light of deliverance. For what are we but the excrement of non-existent noon? truth like starlight crookedly. What are we but burial grounds abhorred by the moon? And did the Maoris die of measles? So do we. But there is no snow here, nor lilies. The night is glutinous. In a broad hearth crisscross thorn clumps smoulder. Distant fireback of copse throws back silence. Glass and ashes gleam in pond. The constellations which have stopped working shimmer. No dead leaf jumps. On edge of lawn, a glowworm hangs out its state-recognized torch lamp. Blocks of flowers gape dumb as windows with blinds drawn. And in the center, the rugate trees, though seeming as if they go up in smoke, are held like cardboard where they are. Blue hot, it is queer fuel to make the moon move. One day, one of his foreclaws, assembled as usual by many men, being longer than the other, turns and pinches his tentacles. With the other he pinches the persons that assembled the long one. Next day the short one, equally alien, is the longer. And the process is reversed. In mass production, one hand never knows the evil the other is inspiring it to do. This is a heretic even into the faiths he fails to believe. So worthless, awkward, unintelligible, the crab crawls on. He has suffered because he was ugly. Let him be cruel now that he is attractive, caring not whether he fructifies cruelty or is merely hard on self. We trap our goldfinch, trapping our souls there winged, sacrifice our mad gods to the madder gods. We hymn the two sons of Leda and Zeus, Aegis bearer. We don't. We drink and drivel. My poor Catullus, do stop being such a fool. Admit that lost which you watch is gone. Oh, once the days shone very bright for you, when where that girl you loved so, as no other will be called, you came, and then and there were odd things done, and many which you wanted, and she didn't not want. Yes, indeed, the days shone very bright for you, but now she doesn't want it. Don't you either, booby. Don't keep chasing her. Don't live in misery. Carry on. Be firm. Be hardened. Goodbye, girl. Catullus is quite hardened. Doesn't want you. Doesn't ask. If you're not keen, though sorry you'll be to be not asked. Yes, poor sinner, what is left in life for you? Who'll now go with you? Who'll be attracted? Whom will you love now? Whom say you belong to? Whom will you now kiss? Whose lips will you nibble? Now you, Catullus, you've decided to be hardened. How can I be hardened when the whole world is fluid? Oh, Aphrodite Pandemos, your badgers rolling in the moonlit corn, corn bloom-coloured, carpeting the wind, wind humming like distant rooks busy like factory whirring metallic starlings, bizarre like cogwheels missing teeth. These last grinning like the backs of old motor cars smelling of Traeger-Machality denoting the triumph of self over civilization. Civilization being relative to Greek to Persian, Persian to Chinese politely making Borgarithms to show satisfaction a matter of capacity not significance, otherwise an epigrams, poems with a strabismus being as common spiritually as optically the moon trampling regular steps like a policeman past the houses of the zodiac, and the zodiac itself whirling and flaming sideways, and circling from no point, returning through no point, endlessly skidding as long as man skids, though never moving. Wavers, topples, dissolves like a sandcastle into acidity. Is there nothing more soluble, more gaseous, more imperceptible? Nothing. Now, that is just a half section of one canto from 12. So hopefully you can see why the ecliptic took me 6 months of study to understand. For me, though, its attractiveness has always been, and this is from the first day I started reading it, its powerful musicality, its daring, overarching metaphors, its symbolism, the many threads of this 2,700-line poem do actually enmesh. Cancer combines psychological states. Nature is humanized, invoking the desolate environment and stagnant atmosphere of the previous canto, which is Aries. As the Kurtz synopsis guides, in the Cancer phase of life, our 20s, that's 20 years, 20s, that's our ages, so from 20 to 29 years of age, the will fails, and thus the mechanics of the universe surrounding the hypothetical single consciousness also fail. Nature has been stripped of meaning and significance, the glowworm standardized with its state-recognized torch lamp. Blocks of flowers are presented lifeless and colourless in the simile used to describe them, dumb as windows with blinds drawn. The trees rugate, creased and seeming as if they are about to go up in smoke, but held like cardboard where they are. There is a curious combining of emotional stagnation and the symbolic landscape of the ecliptic, lending to a sinister atmosphere. And this is to do with the 20s, this time the period 1920 to 29, where mechanization was taking place, and as Macleod sees it, a kind of a sort of lifelessness and colourlessness because of this mechanization. A disjunction between the human and the natural world is suggested, as though the two are opposed. Toward the end of the phase, the Roman poet Catullus, 84 to 54 BC, becomes the central subject. Flesh is now added over the bare bones that are the desolation and desperation in the early lines of Cancer, which describe the crab's awkward movement across a metaphorical moonscape. It becomes apparent that this atmosphere has been generated since the single consciousness is now undergoing a rejected lover's despair. The narrative becomes fiercely critical of the modern world towards the canto's end, reflecting the single consciousness's emotional fragility. We end with the zodiac circling from no point, returning to through no point, endlessly skidding as long as man skids, though never moving, wavers, topples, dissolves like a sandcastle into acidity. The single consciousness enters the Leo phase in a state of Catullus-inspired fluidity. The zodiac soluble, gaseous, and imperceptible, summed up in the emphatic line, nothing. This is in keeping with another of modernity's key concepts. The universe is godless, man now master of his own destiny. There is a quotation from F. Scott Fitzgerald, which I can't recall exactly, but I think it's that man awoke to find the world godless, all wars fought, all fates in man shaken, and that plugs straight into what Macleod's doing here. So Macleod and Fitzgerald are on side with that one. When Terence Gray retired, Macleod became manager and lessee of the Cambridge Festival Theatre at Barnwell in 1933. He worked with actors such as Paul Robeson, who you might know wrote and sang Old Man River, and also won first black man to win an Oscar, and Michael Redgrave, and the playwrights such as Sean O'Casey. Macleod failed to convince a publisher to publish his second long poem, Foray of Centaurs, who regarded it as too obscure, and they also had regarded the ecliptic as too obscure, as you're probably not surprised about, in its entirety, in spite of Basil Bunting's enthusiasm for sections published in Poetry Chicago. It's a huge publication at the time, and T.S. Eliot's Criterion, also huge in this country. He edited and wrote poems for the new Festival Theatre programme instead, some of which are magnificent, but he published no books of poetry again for another 10 years. Macleod became electrocuted while carrying out some lighting work high up above the stage, and left dangling by a rope, he felt he had come to a moment of clarity. And well, yeah, you'd have to read more about it. A new social realist element, however, entered this poetry from this point, which would influence all his future work. So it was quite a big moment in his life. It also sparked off a fascination in Russian theatre history, on which he became an expert. And he would write 3 critically acclaimed books in the 1940s, the most famous being The New Soviet Theatre, which gained a glowing front-page review in the Times Literary Supplement. Interesting when you think that that's the middle of the Second World War. His theatre was highly stylised as Gray's productions, with very modern sets. But tragically, in the end, the books did not balance, and after 3 years, he was forced to sell. He considered becoming a Labour MP, standing as a candidate for Huntingdonshire in 1937, but failed to gain enough seats. Then he gave a talk on Soviet theatre for the BBC, and it became so popular that the BBC replayed it not once, not twice, but 3 times. His voice was acclaimed by the public, and BBC offered him temporary work as an announcer, which in 1938 became a permanent position. Throughout World War II, Macleod was one of the 4 London-based newsreaders. And if I can recall it properly, when he used to introduce it, he was very famous for the way he introduced himself. He'd say, this is the BBC News, and this is Joseph Macleod reading it. Like that, you know. It's very famous. Find it somewhere on YouTube. Unbeknown to his BBC colleagues and superiors, Macleod was also highly productive as a poet at this time, publishing under a pseudonym, Adam Drynan. He published 4 very different long poems from 1940 to 1944, The Cove, The Men of the Rocks, The Ghost of the Strath, and Women of the Happy Island. The Men of the Rocks and The Ghost of the Strath are linked since they are largely concerned with Highland clearances and further atrocities committed by English lairds in the 18th century, and this links back to Macleod's ancestry and feelings of anger about that. John Lehman at Leonard Woolf's Hogarth Press, who you might have heard, obviously Leonard Woolf being Virginia's husband, published a third of the Men of the Rocks' pages in his Poets of the Tomorrow series in Volume 3. The Cove is concerned with wartime England and the threat of impending invasion. A further 2 appeared in 1951 and 53, and all but the 51 publication were written under the pseudonym Adam Drynan. He didn't want any of his listeners on the radio to know who he was, and I think it's because of this political aspect, and he was obviously scared of losing his job at the BBC. But no one worked it out. Adrian Stokes, still Macleod's closest friend, handled his correspondence from his house in, and I love this name, Little Park Owls in Cornwall, and he got visits from W.S. Graham and also Stephen Spender, who was also an alumni from here. Stephen Spender couldn't work it out and kept coming back 3 or 4 times to see if he could catch Stokes out, and he couldn't, so he gave up. He believed that Adrian Stokes was Drynan. Stokes didn't go to this college, he went to another college, so he wouldn't know who he was. Compton Mackenzie was one man who Macleod did let into his confidence. You might know Compton Mackenzie as the author of Whiskey Galore. He was also an MI6 agent, hence he lived in Barra in a distant island in the middle of nowhere and just spoke Gaelic most of the time. So Macleod and his wife Kit often visited him there at his home on this remote island, Barra, during the war. Mackenzie was a huge admirer of Macleod's Drynan work. From these visits came the inspiration for Women of the Happy Island, 1944 publication, a sequence of 41 soliloquies from the point of view of the women left behind to till the land and look after the children, alone in the absence of the men fighting, wondering if they will ever return. The women's solitude is enforced by war, and their stoicism reinforces community spirit, one example of socialist realism in Macleod's work. As one man observes in the opening of one such poem, faith of women keeps this crowded island from sinking. The same poem closes, faith of women keeps this happy island from suicide. So you can see the social realist element of that, very realistic, very brutal. The women struggle to maintain their family crofts and houses in anticipation of their husbands' and sons' return is the central focus of the book, as the following section of poetic prose combined with soliloquy demonstrates. This is item 3 on your handout. A cluster of small fields. In the absence of her man, a woman is dibbling potatoes into the turves she has scraped off the rock and turned upside down. She does not look away from her toil. She is part of the earth, become mobile and volitional, between the roots of her feet and the birds sat on her back. Put the land in good heart for their return. Lime with the shell sand, the grassland for their return. I sell our daughters to basic slag for their return. Neeps be sowing, neeps for their return. Globes that will gleam and keep for their return. What if we have no sleep for their return? Be oats wherever there was heather for their return. What if the soil beneath that you prepare for their return is hard to the fork as rubber for their return? Would you not give your souls for their return? Will you not give your bodies for their return? Is the bed sweet to the soul and the body that ache for their return? The bitterness of death stays the old for their return. The gladness of living day halts the youth for their return. The round world itself delays for their return. Oh no, it will not wait for their return, but the luck of the land will be consumed for their return, though the world by you and them is sweeter in turning. In Women of the Happy Island, Macleod often mimics Hebridean folk song. This is the 3rd volume in succession, composed utilising techniques of Gaelic poetry, and here it is integral to almost every poem. Here, a lonely woman dibbling potatoes awaits the return of her man, which is dramatically expanded to include all women in the Isle of Barra that are awaiting their men, which forms a kind of incantation building through the refrain for their return. The contrasting flatness to each of the preceding lines building into an eerie chant as their spirits seem to merge and unify in their yearning. The sensation is evoked that half the women's lives are on hold due to their lovers being absent, their other halves. The assonance of "will you not give your bodies?" and the darkly ironic linkage of youth which becomes consumed in the final 2 stanzas evidence the sonic beauty Macleod had learnt to produce. There is completeness in every line, which is an element of Gaelic poetry which Macleod replicates in English. This is an extremely innovative element to Macleod and very hard to do. Sorley MacLean failed to do it. Countless others failed to do it. Auden, Macleod's the only one that managed to do it. It's in every book of poetry that he does as Drynan. Macleod's final published collection of poetry, An Old Olive Tree, in 1971, contains two poems addressed to his closest friends and contemporaries, Adrian Stokes and Graham Greene. Macleod sent Stokes the flame on the candle in a letter. It is a touching elegy to his old friend who passed away in 1972. In these poems, unnecessary ornament is removed, leaving a strong simplicity, very, very different to the ecliptic from 50 years before, as in the Drynan poetry. A Dream of Envy, whose subject is Graham Greene, personal and unadorned, addresses him directly in old age. This is item 4 on your handout. A Dream of Envy. I dreamed that I was summoned to your to your sickbed, or was it mine? Your hematic eyes wide as when we were friends. Your wit is ever wry, taut, quiet, but your muscles, or could they be mine, lay limp possibilities of a child, no public hair, and the organs undeveloped. Tender this made me, but being no doctor, I could do nothing. My inadequacy woke me to know again you were miserable and famous. Despite the lack of dedication in the book itself, Greene recognised himself as the addressee upon reading the copy Macleod sent. Such was the understanding they had between each other. He wrote back, "Thank you so much for an old olive tree. I liked very much A Dream of Envy, perhaps best of all. When we were friends, why the past tense? As one gets old, it becomes harder to write." That was his excuse for failing to reply to several letters from Macleod. Macleod, well, it's not just that. He was always a busy, if you know Graham Greene's life story, and from about 70 onwards was probably his busiest period as a spy, and he was always too busy to do anything. Macleod was retired by that point. Macleod hinted at various his reasons for not seeking out publication between 1954 and 1971 in his 1973 BBC TV interview. This is one reason that Macleod really kind of became forgotten. He sort of stopped writing after 1953, and this was largely really down to some criticism from Hugh MacDiarmid, who said that his verse was backward-looking and non-innovative and all that kind of thing. And for some reason, Macleod believed it, which is strange because nobody else, apart from Hugh MacDiarmid, who was notoriously nasty in his criticisms, nobody else agreed with MacDiarmid, but Macleod took it all to heart. But asked if he can compose with the same dedication of before, he states, "No, not as much as I used to, no. Or I can hardly be bothered to finish one work before I start the next." So in his archive, there's a lot of unfinished work. He emphasizes the wish for acceptance as a writer as strong as to be accepted as an Englishman of Scottish parentage, though he says that in old age, there is not the same pressure of belonging. Whatever pressures he felt he had to conform to, whether to avoid groups and movements, which he regularly did, he always avoided the Auden group. He always avoided the various other groups that went on in the 20s and 30s. But whether they were literary, social, political, or indeed a mixture of these were all released as soon as his wife died when he was 53, his first wife, and 2 years after, when his new life began with his second wife in Florence with sculptress Maria Theresa. Furthermore, the more immediate preoccupation of fatherhood took precedence, sidelining previous obsessions and insecurities. But there was that one last book in 1971. But yes, there is still hope for his work, and I think for a number of reasons. Firstly, the ecliptic is a tour de force of wordplay and versification, still as bewildering in its genius today as it was for Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot 85 years ago, and indeed Basil Bunting and various others. Secondly, Scotland remains a country where poetry is important and poets are cherished. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to elaborate here, but in my book I demonstrate at length how Macleod championed Scotland and Scottish identity and took elements of Scots and Gaelic single-handedly, weaving them into English language, standard English. And this is an unusual and singular thing about Macleod. He did manage to weave Scots and Gaelic into standard English. He advocated for quality of verse coupled with depth of meaning. He was universally acknowledged in the English-speaking world as an important and capable poet by the likes of Basil Bunting, T.S. Eliot, Graham Greene, W.S. Graham, William Carlos Williams, and countless others. He immortalizes Scottish history with an unsurpassed honesty infused with beauty. In short, Joseph Macleod's work in all of these guises deserves to be read, and whoever reads them will find themselves richly rewarded. Many thanks to all of you for coming here to listen today. Thank you.
So do you have time for a couple of questions?
Sure, go ahead, yeah.
Any questions, anyone?
Anything at all, it's fine.
This huge correspondence that you're describing.
Yeah.
I mean, 10,000 letters, is that what you were saying?
Well, that was the ones in the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh, but then there was the ones that were uncollected altogether, so they were all just jumbled up in a massive pile with separate envelopes and just stuff all over the place, and that was people such as Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot and Basil Bunting, and like massive figures that I'd read all the poems when I was an undergrad. So, but no, it was a lot. It was maybe like, I don't know, 20.
Does he say anywhere, either in the correspondence or elsewhere, what he thinks he's doing in his this?
Yeah, I mean, there's some description, but not really very much in it. Quite hard for me to actually. I think there was Adrian Stokes' letters to him, because there's a lot of correspondence between Adrian Stokes and Macleod, and they have been published. Some of them, they certainly have been in different volumes, but not all of them. But yeah, he does sometimes sort of give an inkling as to what the poems are about, and then you know you're on the right lines, if you know what I mean. With some of them, it's very difficult poetry, and there was no critical background to it. So it's like if you sit down, I mean, you guys will all know, if you sit down and you read, I don't know, Auden, it's nice to read a critical account so that you know that you're on the right lines about what it means. I didn't have any of that, so it was like free climbing. So if you remember, you know that film Free Solo, where he climbs right to the top of, that's basically what it was like. There was no ropes, there was nothing. But that was quite exhilarating. And I used to do free climbing, actually, until I nearly fell off when I was 17. So it felt like that. It felt like really scary. It was, but then that's the sort of essays I'd always done. I'd always done essays that didn't rely on theory. I don't really have this interest, and I know you're supposed to have that interest, but really I'm not an academic these days, but in lenses, so looking at things through a Marxist lens, a feminist lens, and so on. This whole book is written just through my own lens, that's it. Because if I start going into Marxist lens, feminist lens, and so on, I think it would be well confusing. You wouldn't understand any of it, I don't think. So it's just a straightforward practical criticism, that's it. So it's a bit like being at primary school where you're just doing practical criticism with no critical references at all. So that's all I was able to do. And to be honest, I couldn't find much now in the letters, or there's a few paragraphs from Stokes. Probably adds up to about 5 pages of A4 of what Stokes said about his poetry, the different poems. But usually it was just encouraging and trying to get him to keep writing, because Macleod was quite a nervous character. So it's always trying to say, well done, keep going. And, he was always trying to say, well done about his work at the BBC. Because he kept encountering problems there, because he was always reading Russian grammar and upsetting the BBC powers that be, because it's all kind of, he was sort of breaking every rule in the book, really, and refusing to talk to anybody.
I suppose what prompted my question is, I wondered who he thought he was being influenced by when he writes the ecliptic. Is it that he thinks he's influenced by Pound?
Yeah, I think
that's partly right.
I see, right. Yeah, there's letters between Macleod and Pound, where Macleod lists off who he thinks are the movers and shakers of the present day. So that'd be like 1930. So, for example, he says things like, Auden has started to bore me since he's moved to America. I think that's a direct quotation. I can't quite remember. I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but he says something about how he talks about all the guys that he was with here, basically, the Oxford poets and also Cambridge. And he basically comes down upon it that there's no decent poets around now because they don't write long poems. And then of course Pound replies back, nodding, going, "Yes, you're quite right." We're the only 2 decent ones. Oh, and Bunting, and sometimes Eliot, But I think he even says about Eliot to Pound, so it shows you that they weren't as close friends as people might think. That Pound's afraid of his own skin or something like that. Sorry, Eliot's afraid of his own skin. So so that means that Eliot sort of published in order to make sure that the public were happy, which I don't know. When I first started out as an undergraduate, I thought Eliot was extremely difficult to read. But then I didn't realise you've got different levels. You've got Pound, you've got Bunting, you've got Macleod. It's like it's all these horrible levels that you can go up. for modernist poetry.
What does, sorry, I keep asking you more questions all the time, but it's so
Yeah.
interesting. What does Macleod make of Pound's politics?
Oh right, yes, no, that's not mentioned at all. He totally disregards that. I think Macleod basically saw Pound as a genius. He really bought into his cantos, and it's in his diaries. It says, you know, bought the next section of the cantos, whichever section it was, and started to read. You know, there's no comment on them, but he obviously loved reading it. So I think that continued throughout, even after he'd become more clear in his clarity in the Dryden poetry. It's a lot clearer than the stuff that he did in the ecliptic. So although he only had a brief period where he wrote like Pound or something similar to Pound, it's not the same as Pound at all. It's a very different style, I think. I think he has a lot more musicality and rhythm, and there's all sorts of other things that he does that Pound doesn't do as much of, I think. But he still admired it all the way through. You know, there's no doubt about it that he loved Pound's work. He couldn't understand anybody that didn't love it. But then not everybody had the education that Macleod had. He was highly educated. I mean, in those days, an 18-year-old coming to Balliol from Rugby would have total command of Latin, would have vast sections of Shakespeare stuck in their heads that they have been forced to remember, and if they don't remember them, they get beaten up by the teacher. You know, it's simple as that. You know, so he's from a different generation. It's not. I was thinking that last night, how different their lives were to my life, or you know, it's a very different world really. They were brought up in a very different way. They had to learn Shakespeare by heart. They had to understand Shakespeare. They had to read Homer in Latin and Greek and understand the difference between the two. So yeah, I think by the time he came to Balliol, he was already extremely well read, you know. So, and then by the time he left, by the time he'd written the ecliptic, he was very well read. So he would be able to read Pound and see all of the links to everything. And I think that's the thing. If you do have, it's like I have the knowledge of the ecliptic. When I read the ecliptic, I see lots of things in it because I spent a lot of time studying it. Somebody brand new to it might just be freaked out and just throw it across the room, you know, which would be fine. I would understand that, which is kind of what I did to start with. Yeah, but I persevered with it because that's the sort of person I am. I like to know what things mean. So, and if you like to know what things mean, you always find Macleod interesting because there's always a meaning behind a meaning behind a meaning. You know, so it's if that makes sense. Sorry to ramble on, just too much to talk about. So, yeah. My friends always tell me I talk too much.
I wonder if you say a bit about the unpublished plays you mentioned that he also wrote.
Right, yeah. So when he was at the Cambridge Festival Theatre, I maybe didn't mention this actually, but he did actually put his own plays on as well, and some of them are very good, you know. But I have to say that I mean, Andrew Duncan, who's written, I should say, also I asked him to put 2 chapters in for this because I think it's beyond my experience really, but he's an expert in modernism, and I wanted somebody that would really pin down how Macleod fits into the modernist world. And so Andrew's 12 pages that are in here are about that. He does mention in his own book, which is at the back there, I mean, basically Andrew Duncan brought the first ever resurgence book of Macleod out, if you like, and that's his selected poems. And in his introduction, he talks about the plays that Macleod wrote himself. So he wrote like a translation of Aeschylus's The Suppliants, for example, and he wrote a play called Overture to Cambridge, which he produced as a novel. My feeling is it's a much better novel than a play. So what I've done is I've typed it all up and edited it and introduced it. So hopefully that's going to come out in the next year or so with Waterloo Press as well. And that's Macleod's only published novel. But it's brilliant. It's sort of based on the sort of style of H.G. Wells, but it's his own style. It's Macleod's own thing again. But yeah, no, his plays are worth looking at, but they're not. I don't think they're ground shaking. There's about 30 of them in the archive. He wrote a lot of plays, about as many as Shakespeare did. I think Macleod didn't. He never stopped writing. He was writing like all the time, and it's like there's about 30 plays, 40 manuscripts of poems. Only 8 of them actually saw the light of day and got published. There's 10 novels, only one of those got published. So he really did write a lot, but I think he sort of, his father was at Rio Tinto. He brought up in this massive mansion of a house in the north of Scotland, and then when he was brought up, he brought up in Ealing in a very fancy sort of flat, in the centre of London, and then he went to Rugby, then he went to Balliol. So he never really had to work, really. So it's amazing that he did any work at all, So when he went to the BBC, he didn't really have to be there, So, but I think it's just the way he was. He didn't want to ask his parents for money, and his father, when he died, left him with that mansion and left him all this stuff. And that was about when he was 52, 53. So he didn't really have to keep working anymore, So I don't know, maybe that's why, I think that's why he didn't push to be published, but the quality of the work's still there. But I really do think his best quality was as a poet, and then secondarily as a theatre historian, and that's what he says in his interviews, the 2 or 3 interviews he ever agreed to do, basically. But that's what I would say. But you can always look at them, and maybe I'm not seeing something, or but I don't think they're. We've thought before about putting 3 or 4 of them into a book of these plays, but I don't know. Andrew Duncan says they're not good enough, so I have to bow down to that. So I mean, he's Andrew Duncan's brilliant. He's one of the best critics I've ever known, really. But he's not attached to any university or anything. But he's a very clever man, so I always go with what he says. So, so if he says that, then I have to bow down to that. So. But I don't know, maybe it's worth looking at, though, because that's just one man's opinion, or 2 men's opinion. I mean, I've read some as well. Maybe they're still worth reading, I think. So, yeah. Anybody else got a question?
Any more?
Anything, seriously, any if it's a minor question, it's fine.
Would you start with the ecliptic? It looks quite intimidating.
No, I wouldn't. I think you'd really sort of put yourself off, I think, if you started with that. I had to start with that because I knew that was, the way I saw it was, I've got 3.5 years to do this thing, and I've got to get my head down and understand the ecliptic, because it was important, because Ezra Pound saw it as important. Basil Bunting was influenced by it, and T.S. Eliot, and that's the 3-pin plug, basically, of modernist poetry, high modernist poetry. T.S. Eliot, Basil Bunting, and Ezra Pound. But Basil Bunting saw it that the 3-pin plug was T.S. Eliot, Macleod, and Pound. So I really had to get my head around it. It was important for what I was doing. But no, I think if you were starting, I would go to Women of the Happy Island or The Men of the Rocks. Just because it just sort of get you into his style. I don't know, because that's mostly what his style's like. The Cove as well, that's brilliant, 1940. And Waterloo include bits of that. The book that I did with Andrew Duncan, I'm not trying to flog myself here, it's just that there's not many books about him, to be quite honest. But there's 3 books in there, and introductions from me for the 2 that I've edited, and introduction from Andrew Duncan for the one that he edited. And that's probably the place to start, I think. Because he did write long poems, he didn't write just short poems, he really focused on long poems. Having said that, there's an enormous amount of uncollected single poems that he had published in magazines and stuff. And one of those methods that he did it was through the, the New Theatre magazine that he, New Festival magazine. And they're all in Cambridge, basically, in the, whereabouts is that? Sorry, the Trinity, yeah, the Trinity Library at Cambridge, yeah. So every single one of them are there, and only 3 of them have been published before, but there's millions of them. I mean, he brought one out every week for the sort of 5 years he was there. So, and there's a poem in each one, and they're all brilliant. So there's a lot of stuff to be really pulled together, and this is just the start, really. I mean, you can imagine when it started with this, it was literally a nightmare. There was no essays I could find on him at all. The Oxford University Press, they contacted me and asked him to write his National Dictionary of Biography entry, and I said, "Oh, right, yeah, sure, no problem." And then when I answered the phone, and then he said, "I'm sorry, we can only pay you £100." I thought, wow, that's like 3 nights out. That's brilliant, cool. You know, because I was 25, you know, and yeah. So then, you know, you then use the money for 3 nights out. It was great. And yeah, no. It was,
so he's in the ODNB then?
Yeah, and I wrote it when I was 25, so it's probably not as good as it should be. I don't know, but it's a decent sort of outline of his career. But that's all I knew of him at the time. But they said, "Oh, we need it now," and because they said they were embarrassed to think that he's not in there, and that's because I'd done the Wikipedia page for him. You see, so somebody must have seen that and then thought, "Oh God, he's not in our publication," because they like to have everybody in there. I think there's 40,000 people in there. But yeah, I found that like Virginia Woolf did one for somebody. That's great. I thought, like, wow, I'm in the same publication as Virginia Woolf. Yeah, but no, it was nice. And then at the Times Literary Supplement, they asked me to do a double-page spread, so you can find that somewhere. I think it's like January 2009 or 2010. I think it is January 2010. That's it. One of those Times Literary Supplements, and that's again, it's like a reasonable outline, I suppose, in 4,000 words. But I think everything that I've done is really tried to point towards the Drynan stuff. The stuff that he did for Scotland is just, that's really Macleod. That's what he really wanted to do. And he really wanted to write documentary verse, basically, which is the same sort of thing that MacNeice would do, although that sounds very loose. But so if you're interested in MacNeice, and you could tie MacNeice to Macleod, I guess, in an essay or something like that, because documentary verse is what Macleod wanted to nail down, and he tries to do it through, like I say, Soviet socialist realism, which isn't in the ecliptic, you see. So that's the ecliptic's like a weird, unknown thing, really. And also the other poem that went straight after that, 1931, Foray of Centaurs, which is edited by Andrew Duncan and published by Waterloo finally in like, I think 2000. So it was never published in Macleod's lifetime. But that's also Latin based, and you know, it's a totally different thing, classical mythology and so on, which I find fascinating. I love it, but I wouldn't say it's what everybody would find fascinating. So, but if you like Pound, then you would like the ecliptic. So it's like that. So depends what you want, really.
Okay, lovely. Well, shall we stop there, and then
Yeah.
people want to talk to you
Sure.
afterwards?
Yeah.
Welcome to, and everyone is welcome to have a glass of wine to raise the and thank you very much, James, for coming to talk to us about this neglected Balliol author.
Welcome. Thank you very much.